All right, let's jump right in. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We're super excited today. I think most of you who are on the line know the team, kind of in the different roles that we bring to the table, the different perspectives we bring to the table. I think you'll be hearing mostly from Emily and Julie today about something that we're really excited to dive into, and that's Microsoft's learning pathways. So a little bit of kind of what it is and why should I care. Maybe an example of how some of our clients are using this in innovative ways. Maybe some inside baseball from Julie, who was one of the principal creators of this application, and then open Q&A. So I'm going to jump right into the what is it. And Emily, I know that you have presented this a hell of a lot more than I have. Are you comfortable to kind of take us through this?
Sure. And Julie, please jump in as well.
Yeah.
So what I love about Learning Pathways, it's a central location for all Microsoft 365 training content that you can deploy as a site collection to your environment. It comes with a lot of content initially, but you can also add any custom content, which we'll talk through some of those scenarios today. So the ability to make your own training playlists of content on your intranet, as well as external content that you can have in an iframe, is incredibly powerful to reduce that friction of putting some of the in-context learning across your environment for your colleagues.
Yeah, I guess I could point out that the content is also updated. The content that comes with it from Microsoft is updated quarterly, or at least that's the cadence that they try to stick to, give or take a week or two in either direction. But in general, they're going to be working on behind the scenes every quarter to update and enhance the playlists that come with the solution, and that update happens automatically because what the solution is doing is bringing that content in through what we refer to as manifests from an external source, in this case GitHub Pages. And so they'll update those manifests, and within 24 hours, your users are going to see those updated, maybe additional, maybe some are removed, playlists that have more, are focusing on and featuring more content than from before. And then obviously to the point that Emily sort of already made is you can curate that. As an admin of Learning Pathways, you can go in and hide or show any of the particular content that you want to, customize that content so that if a particular step in a playlist is not one that you agree with or not one that you do in your organization or whatever, and you want to remove it, either replace it with something else or whatever, you can do all of that. You can also hide in bulk sets of content based on the technology. And so that is pretty powerful to at least curate what you want, and then, as Emily said, to augment with anything else that you might want to put training around.
And augment is such an incredible approach. I've spent so much more time creating custom training than I'd probably like to acknowledge. And since Learning Pathways now exists, to be able to leverage and connect all of that wonderful Microsoft generated content of the technical clicks, since that UI is constantly changing, and bring that into your environment instead of making it on your own and inevitably falling behind, just really reduces that burden on IT to create it.
Yeah. There's a question from Russell about how the new playlists get imported. And it's not that they're imported, it's that every time the web part loads, it looks at a cache of all the playlists that you have in your environment based on ones that you've hidden, ones that you haven't hidden, or technologies that you've turned on or off, plus all your custom content. And it caches that for 24 hours. If within that 24-hour period, Microsoft updates their manifest at the GitHub repo, then once that 24 hours is over, it's going to see, because it's going to go check and re-update the cache. So it's going to reach out to the GitHub area where the JSON files are and update those caches based on the configuration. And it is done every time you load the admin web part. It actually refreshes the caches, or if it's the user web part, or the view, I like to call it the viewer web part, that if nobody goes into the admin web part, within 24 hours, a viewer hitting the web part will update the cache. So that's the answer to those two questions. No problem.
Mike,
yeah.
you're on mute.
Yep.
There we
Thanks everybody for some, like, please keep them coming. Like, submit the questions as we go. If there's something in a slide,
Or raise
you
your
don't
hand
understand.
and ask too.
Absolutely.
So we can have a
Yes.
conversation. Yep.
Yes.
It's a little tricky to talk and read the chat window at the same time. So
Roger that.
yeah.
All right. So that's the kind of high level, what is it? And to make it a bit more real and answer the why should I care question, I think we're gonna ask Emily to take over the presenting. Oh, a nice dissolve transition there. Okay, sure. To kind of demo this for us and just show us a little bit about the solution in action, and I'm sure that'll spur more questions and conversation as well.
I think Emily will probably hit on Greg's question, which is, can you add your own training content to it? So I think Emily, what you're going to show will cover that.
Yes, so I'll start with that one actually. So for example, you create something custom within your Microsoft 365 environment. Google's not going to help any of your employees. So let's go through an example here. We have a partner order management system for all your really important orders you need to make from the Hogwarts partners. Let's say I'm an employee and I'm going through, I'm going to skip this part if it doesn't load, and trying to create a quote. And let's say the partner is missing, right? So someone needs to know how to add a partner. Of course, we have these handy buttons, but let's say I'm a new employee. I have no idea how to. Right here on the bottom of the page, so in context of where they're completing all of their actions for this custom solution, are different training courses from the Learning Pathways web part. So yes, Learning Pathways is a standalone site collection, but what I love most about it is then taking those playlists I create there and putting them in the web parts on the pages where people should be diving in. So for example, let's look at
keep going on. Yep.
Yeah. Setting up new partners. Here we are. I have this nice little arrow to make me full screen so I can dive in, and clicking the drop down, right? I first have some introductory information of, hey, before you add your partner, let's talk about negotiating with them. And then here we go, how to add a partner. And I even have a little video embedded on stream so someone can watch this video to see that process.
Yeah, and I think that's super powerful. And just to give it a little more context, what Emily is basically saying is that we have a site collection that is your training home site. And I get a lot of questions in the repo and elsewhere where people are like, well, can I install Learning Pathways more than once in a tenant? And the answer is no, but the reason the answer is no is because of architectural decisions we made early, which were that if you're going to have training content, you want to effectively manage that from a central location with your training staff that is going to curate and collect that training material all in one spot. That does not mean that your custom training assets all need to be in this site. It's just that you use this site as a place to bring everything together. So you can create a playlist and point to a page, a SharePoint page that has custom training content on it that might live in some other site collection. That's completely acceptable, as long as that location of that asset is going to have the same permission structure as your Learning Pathways site has permission. So that's the one caveat. You got to think about your permissions a little bit. But assuming that you've managed that permission structure, you can point to assets anywhere else in your tenant, and this allows you to curate it in one central location, and then you can put that viewing web part on any site collection in your tenant and be able to filter it down to just the content you want to show in that location for whatever purpose that is, just like Emily showed with this the small subcategory she's created for Hogwarts pricing solution. So she created a special subcategory under products for these playlists that she created, and then she filtered it right down there on the page so that that's the only thing the users are seeing when they get there. And so that ability to sort of place that viewer web part wherever and filter it down to just the right content that you want your users to see. So that could just be a playlist too. You can filter it right down to a playlist or a group of playlists in a subcategory or a whole category of things, like here's our site where we're going to talk about all the products in Office 365 or whatever it might be. So I just wanted to clarify that architecture a little bit. Cool.
And then to Julie's point, one of the, since you're pointing to these pages can be anywhere in your environment, again, as long as you make sure they're accessible to everyone in your intended audience, you're also taking the ownership off of either the training team or IT to be updating all of this information. Once that page is added to a playlist, anytime someone edits that page and hits republish, great news, that's already feeding to that playlist. So it feeds perfectly into the better practice of making sure the content lives where the content owners have access. Moving off of our example of creating your own documentation and creating pages in partner order management to show the process of how to use that custom solution, you might also want to create playlists for something like self-service. So here we have this SharePoint champion site. We have news and updates to share with this group of people who are our site owners. We like them knowing what is coming on the M365 landscape, as well as we have monthly meetups and meetings. But then again, we're putting these training playlists right into the context of where they're working. So instead of hosting many training sessions for self-service to teach them about these communication site guidelines, now instead they have the opportunity to come here and go through this playlist in the order that I create so they can learn how to do anything within our environment to our best practices. And I can choose to mix some of the information that's developed by Microsoft on creating sites. I don't need to recreate that. And then I might add in a couple pages around my governance or my guidelines so people know our naming conventions and our other better practices around internal, external sharing and things like that. The last example I have is on a team site as well. Think about fostering a culture of learning in your organization. So previously, I was a platform owner at a biotech, and one of the biggest questions I got was around Excel training. And there wasn't someone on the IT team who had bandwidth to deliver that all the time, but you can still create that experience of some independent learning and highlighting some training content. So again, make another playlist on that Learning Pathways site, and then you maybe even change it monthly for your team if you're trying to raise their technical literacy in specific programs. My new favorite way to use it is to create documentation as a consultant for my clients that I'm working with. So very often we are working with someone who is moving into Microsoft 365 for the first time or trying to increase their maturity on the platform that they're using. So moving from one site and subsites and folders to a flat site collection. They're learning all about hub sites and site designs. It's a lot of information. So what I've been doing is creating a playlist in the Learning Pathways for those new SharePoint admins. So every single thing I teach them or show them, whether it's a Microsoft documentation or something that we created for them for a process that we helped them implement at their company, it's all in one playlist for them. So thinking back to an earlier Ask Simpraxis meeting about documentation, I very much use Learning Pathways for that documentation with clients as well.
That just happened today, actually. Emily and I were working on a Word document that I had created to document an administrative process for a client. And she's like, we should probably put this in a page and make it part of this playlist. And, you know, as a dinosaur, I, of course, thought about making it a Word document and embedding that in a document library somewhere. Her approach makes it, accessible and promotable from multiple locations, if that makes sense. In this case, it's an administrative thing. It really makes sense to a small audience, but that playlist can then be in one place and be useful for that set of people.
Could I ask a question about? I see a great use case for site owners who need to have specific training to be eligible to own a site under your whatever your governance rules are. Does Learning Pathways have the capability, or maybe is it in a future capabilities around I can track who took what training?
So I'm going to address that by first saying that I want to make sure we're super clear that Learning Pathways was not meant to be an LMS system at all.
Thanks for clarifying.
So that's definitely something that we are not intending to be or trying to be. That said, you can sort of, by thinking along the lines of you can put anything in a playlist that you can put on a page, you certainly could implement something like a Microsoft form or even a custom web part on a page as the last item in a playlist that maybe implemented a quiz or, took in some information about that particular user signing off on that they completed this training or, something along those lines. So you could do that kind of thing, certainly with your own customizations, but that's not an LMS aspect of learning pathways like out of the box.
Good. No, that wasn't the intention, clearly, but good.
Right.
Great to define what it is and what it isn't intended to be.
Right.
I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Could you use SharePoint's regular auditing to see who has gone to pages, to see who's gone to a specific page that's included in a playlist?
No, because keep in mind that I actually don't know. I can't speak to how the iframe would track views exactly, right? So I don't want to speak to that piece of it, but the playlist is iframing in pages. So it's not like you're changing the page that you're on, you're only changing the page in the iframe. And so I don't know how that tracking exactly works from the perspective of if it's gonna know from an audit perspective.
You or Emily mentioned earlier that we had to make sure the permissions on the content were correct. So that makes me think that there is an authentication piece. So if I don't have permission, I can't go to it. But
I
should get audited.
I agree entirely. I'm just not exactly sure how that site tracking is implemented. And so I don't want to say for certain that audit is there. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
But theoretically, yes.
Yeah, I think it would be a bunch of work too, because you'd have to know where all the pages were to be able to pull the relevant data from the audit log. I do think those page loads would be recorded, but it would be sort of buried in a pile of data. Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking about analytics that we use, and I'm not sure you'd see them in the analytics as page views, right?
Yeah,
if they're embedded in the iframes.
So good news. I just tested this live, and it does show that I viewed the page in the audit log, so we can confirm
there
that.
you go. All right. Todd Clint for the win. Emily for the verify.
Emily, this is twice in like the span of 75 minutes that I've had a couple of brilliant outbursts. So
you have a set, and then I spike it, and it's just a good team.
And I thought I wouldn't contribute anything to this particular session.
And there you go, and just change everything. To answer Shelley's question about, I'm going to actually let Emily answer Shelley's question, but Shelley's asking, can you confirm that if a page that is in a playlist is changed to promote it as a news page, it does not impact the pathway? I assume there would be no impact, but want to be sure. I'm pretty sure the answer is no, because it is just a page, but I'll
Correct.
let you. Okay.
Yes. So the thing that changes on SharePoint pages between the page and the news is not the URL. So because you're adding the URL to learning pathways, you're correct. That doesn't get impacted at all. It's a site column for promoted state where 0 is a page, 1 is news saved as a draft, and 2 is a news page that is published. So since it's just metadata, it is not something that will impact connecting it to learning pathways.
Yep. And then Russell's question about securing certain playlists to only members of a group. We do not have that level of granular security. Obviously, I say that, but if you change the security so only a particular group can see it, you're going to have a bad user experience, but they won't be able to see it. So there is that. Otherwise, there is no real concept for learning pathways of securing particular items in the configuration, we'll call it.
I'd say two
Julie.
workarounds for that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Oh, I was gonna ask Julie, is it possible the content in the playlist may not be secured, but you could secure the page that showed the playlist?
That's correct. Yes.
So if you have limited page permissions, and as Julie mentioned, that's a bad user experience for someone to try to click on a playlist and then they have to request access, and you definitely don't want to spam your site owner with a bunch of requests for access if they shouldn't have it. Try to set those expectations up front instead that people shouldn't have access, whether it be something like a lock icon in the title and then in parentheses say, limited permissions to, and then be really clear about it. Add content to the description with directions of who they should reach out to get access if you must security trim it. this did come up with one of our clients where they had a non-Microsoft system and they wanted to have training documentation in learning pathways, and there were some for admins, and they didn't want non-admins to see the training, but the non-admins couldn't complete those actions. So there wasn't any real risk in having that information available to them since they couldn't complete those actions. So think about why you're trimming it and if it's people seeing those steps is the problem. So maybe an example would be like a termination process. You probably wouldn't want the HR termination process visible by all. And that's an example where I could see where you definitely would want to security trim it.
Yeah, and I think to go to Derek's point, what he was, I think to expound on it, to extend it a little bit more, I think there's a paradigm here where it says that you have this central learning pathways administrative site. I would encourage people not to point, even though users have access to that site, I might not encourage people to go directly there for their learning content, but rather either embed learning content within other sites that you already have, or set separate sites up for different kinds of learning content. Thereby, to Derek's point, you can security trim that site that has those web parts on it that are filtered to that particular content, and then sort of create that situation where you're driving people to the content they want. Now, obviously, they have access because there is no technical way that we are securing the content in the admin center, but you're obfuscating it enough to sort of lead that. So that's one direction.
The learning pathways web parts don't have audience targeting built into them at this point, right?
They do not have audience targeting built into them at this point, no.
So I think, and I'm just going to restate something that you all just touched on, but the key question here is whether it's a security or an obscurity need, right? Are you just trying to get the right content in front of people? That's one thing. But if you actually need to secure the content, like it's some secret backdoor administrative thing that you don't want most people to see, then it probably doesn't belong in the learning pathways place. It should be somewhere else because it needs to be secured.
And so Russell just had a question about that you can't remove an asset from a Microsoft provided playlist. You have to copy it and then change it. And he's asking if there's any plans to change that. And there is absolutely no plans to change that. The technical lift here is that there is no good way to provide a performant system and allow you to modify the content as it's coming in, because the overhead of having to track every change you want to make to Microsoft provided content and then apply that filter every single time and then manage any time that change doesn't go right is too much of a heavy lift for a client-side solution to do well in a performant way. So there's always going to be this, you can only create copies of things or augment things, but you can't fundamentally change the content that Microsoft provides. However, there is an alternate option, which is to say that if you're that concerned about it or want to micromanage, and using that term in the not bad way, but if you want to micromanage the content that Microsoft provides, like change labels of things and actually remove content from the playlist, you can always fork the Learning Pathways repo and take take copies of the JSON provided assets in that structure and host it yourself. So you can either fork the repo and turn on GitHub Pages for that forked repo and serve this and change your CDN to point to your fork that you then edit and change any way you like, or copy those files in that file structure and host it in a CDN somewhere and point to that CDN and again edit the content any way you like to provide an extremely customized experience. The only issue then is if the content gets updated from Microsoft, you're not going to see that. So you'd want to be following the GitHub repo so that you can be notified that the JSON files have been updated, and then take a look at what was added or removed and then update your own content accordingly. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a pretty fast explanation of something fairly technical, but that would be the way that I would go about doing that.
There were a couple of questions in there about search, and I think Emily sort of answered it by screenshot.
I did. So while they do show up in the search results, you can get the title of those items. They are the different kind of like back-end list items. So if you select that top one, for example, how to negotiate a new partner, it brings me to where that is on the list. It's not bringing me to the pages themselves. So it's not necessarily the best user experience. So while it will give you the results of what exists on Learning Pathways, I don't think it's serving the need that you're thinking of, which is an end user coming to this site and then searching for existing training.
Yeah, there is no real way that we can provide search, Microsoft Search, to search inside the Learning Pathway manifest, as it's just not without providing a custom search provider, which, you know, it's a premium. It's just way beyond the scope of Learning Pathways. So that's not going to be something that you can do. There is search within Learning Pathways, so you can use this search icon within Learning Pathways. There's one in the admin center for adding assets. So when you're creating a playlist, you can search for assets, and you can, you know, use the search terms in those to find the assets that you want to add to a playlist. And then inside the web viewer web part, when you're in the full context view of the web part, you can also search inside there, and it'll find you playlists and assets that have your search term in them. So those are the ways that we provide search, but search, as in Microsoft Search, is not going to work.
And so in this situation, you might end up wanting to put that Learning Pathways full web part on the homepage of Learning Pathways and introduce that search that is going to work for them then, so they can find those
there is by
pages.
default out of the box a custom learning viewer.aspx page in the Learning Pathways site. And so that does provide that. But going back to our previous conversation, if you provide that, then there is no obfuscating any of the content other than what you've hidden as an admin, if that makes sense.
I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. I wanted to pull up the next slide because I think for some of you, this has been useful to get very specific answers to very specific questions about Learning Pathways, and others, maybe, where do I start? Right? What's the logical next step? So we've put some resources and takeaways up here. Julie, Emily, is there anything you'd want to highlight out of these for people just getting started with Learning Pathways?
There is a video where I go deeply dive into, did we put it on here? Let me see.
I think that's the second one.
Is it the second one?
I think so.
Provisioning?
Or is it your community demo?
No. The third one down, excuse me. The third one down, that YouTube video. Shelley. More cowbell. The third one down is a video that provides a really deep dive overview of every single bit of Learning Pathways. And so I'd encourage people to watch that video because it can help them get started to understand the architecture a little bit better, with more visuals and demos of every little technical bit of the solution, where Emily's demos today were more really great ways that you can then take Learning Pathways and make it work in your organization. That demo is more the technical deep dive into the features of the solution itself. So that would be the one I would point people to.
And sorry, Julie, I might have changed those bullets. The fourth one down is that architectural overview you're talking about. That third one is our virtual. Yeah, it's our virtual marathon talk. So it's a longer version of we did a really quick demo, but we go further in depth into those different scenarios, some user experience considerations when you're making the playlist and things like that.
I think somebody had a comment. Would it be nice to sync my customized version with the latest updates from Microsoft? Would be nice if I could sync my customized version. Okay. Oh, I see what the question is. Could you have a way to merge those two things together? Yeah, I'm not. I mean, you can use software that shows diffs between two files, but since they're files, there's no real way that we can provide that kind of syncing.
But if you think it the reverse way, Julie, that you have the Microsoft CDN source, and then you do have a capability in there to create your own CDN, right? So you build your stuff in a separate sort of domain in essence, not a real.
Yeah, and I think what if Russell wants to come off mute and ask more specifically, but I think what he's saying is he'd like a way for that then to just be merged automatically into his customized version.
No, what I was thinking was when I go in and edit my customized version of a playlist, when I'm in that edit mode, if it could check the Microsoft version and provide some facility for me to merge that in right in the UI, it would be a manual thing that the playlist owner would need to take upon himself to do the merge.
So what you're saying is when you make a copy, maintain a pointer back to the original playlist so that if it's updated later,
Exactly.
you could see that that's happening and pull those changes in. I see, instead of recopying, which is effectively what you'd have to do. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Oh, well, so that's a good segue that I should point out that there's the GitHub issue, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th bullet point down is the GitHub repo to submit issues. You can absolutely submit enhancement requests there. So if you have ideas like what Russell just said, submitting them in that issues list as an enhancement goes a long way because the Microsoft team then can look at that. So I get my directions on what enhancements we're going to implement through that team. And so by submitting it there, at least it's in a centralized place for everyone to review that when it comes to doing a new version. So.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. Did want to highlight a couple of upcoming topics. Our next topic in 2 weeks, really interesting project in the community docs world of the Microsoft 365 maturity model, built on some of the work Sadie Van Buren's done in the past. We're very excited to present that, hopefully with a guest speaker. We're going to do 2 weeks from then, Microsoft Ignite will be going on, so we're not going to do a meeting that week, but we hope to recap it 2 weeks hence. As always, if you've got questions or ideas for topics for us that you'd like for us to cover and to drill into, use the URL at the bottom to ask some praxis. And I think we're about out of time. Thank you, Emily and Julie, for your fine work on this and for digging deep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everybody.